Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the 81st session of Majlis Al Khonji. Please allow me to introduce our guest for this session, Mr. Matt Minshall. Mr. Matt spent 25 years in the British Army, during which time he served in Oman, from 1987 to 1989. Since then, he has maintained strong links with Oman, and he is a member of Sultan's Armed Forces Association, the Anglo-Omani Society, and a member of the Omani British Business Council. Under normal circumstances, he travels to Oman several times every year. He has been a private consultant since 1999, and his chosen role is to match requirements with innovative capabilities for Oman. Other activities include support to City Forum, where he is an honorary associate. He is an ambassador for Resolution, a charity which assists servicemen and women suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder to return to a more normal life. He writes occasionally for travel and other journals, where his increasing interests are water security, renewable energy. He is the founder of the Miami Water Project, which aims to harvest water from the air in a manner which is fully sustainable. Welcome, Mr. Matt, to Majlis Al Khonji. And I would like also to welcome Mr. Michael Hansen, the CEO of Al Khonji Group, in moderating this session today. Mr. Mike, over to you, and to Mr. Matt and his presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rehan. Your Excellencies, Mr. Khalil, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 81st session of the Majlis Al Khonji. This evening, we're privileged to have a very good friend of the Majlis, Mr. Matt Minshall, and his presentation continues building on the series that are helping us through this period of the pandemic, and thoughts to help us all think about what we should be doing in the future, what may be coming, how we should adapt. Matt, this evening, is going to focus on leadership in a period of prolonged uncertainty. And this is against the background that with the COVID, probably we need to be thinking more medium term now. So we need to be looking at implications of decisions we make today, but with a 1, 2, 3 year time frame. And Matt is going to put across the theme that COVID has changed the world, and that this actually presents a perfect opportunity to change how we work, how we look at research and social practices. And in tandem with recovery is the critical need for building resilience. Matt, welcome to Majlis Al Khonji, and thank you for being with us, and the floor is with you. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed for that very kind welcome. Just before I share the screen, I would just like to say thank you to Your Excellencies, Mr. Khalil Al Khonji, to Mike and distinguished guests. And I would like to begin by wishing you and your families the very best of safety, good health, and best wishes for the end of the holy month of Ramadan and Eid Mubarak for Eid al-Fitr. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here at the 81st session. And I'm very honored to be able to share some thoughts with you. These are not the answers. They're simply some ideas, which I hope you will agree with, and I hope some of them you may disagree with, which we can discuss and move together globally in a way that helps everybody. So I'm going to now share the screen, and I will talk over the presentation, but I think it helps to illustrate some of my points. Thank you very much again, and I hope this is of interest to you. So, just to check, can you all see the first slide, which is the title, Prevailing Leadership in a Period of Prolonged Uncertainty? Has that popped up yet?
Yes, very clear. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So, when Mike and I started discussing this, the chances of getting something that covers everything is impossible. There's far too much. This is probably the most fascinating, dangerous, and frightening time of my life. I've never seen anything like it, and I have experienced war and other things of uncertainty, but this is something that it could be devastating, but I think if we treat it right, it could be a real opportunity to achieve a great deal, which is positive, and I'm sure you agree. So what we brought it down to was trying to look at 4 pieces. So we say that every cloud has a silver lining. There is always something good that you can take out of anything, however bad it seems. Then what opportunities do we have for beneficial change? We mustn't change for the worse. We mustn't get in a situation where we're just welcoming back the next pandemic. And I'm sure the possibilities are there. Then, as Mike absolutely rightly said, we've got to build resilience. We cannot have parts of the globe that are so fragile that it has a devastating effect on everybody else. We've got to be able to support each other. And then finally, how do we achieve this? By leadership. And one thing from Oman is the leadership is extraordinary. I've seen it for many years. The leadership is there, and then we need to get everybody to follow. So if we take harnessing the value, and I use the expression, every cloud has a silver lining, but I'm also deeply aware that the pandemic has had very different impacts on different people. Sadly, for many, it's been fatal. For many others, it's left enduring health impediments. And there are those for whom it has been soul destroying and deeply mentally disturbing. And something I'm not going to discuss here, but I think it's worth talking about, is that there's going to be a lot of mental health issues which follow this, people who simply could not manage the restrictions. And that's something we need to look at. And it will be something else that we need to use our wealth to cope with. The other end of the divide, which is becoming, it seems, increasingly one of inequality in parts of the world, and the positioning and understanding. And some people simply don't understand what the fuss was. There are people who have been so isolated that they just don't see the problem. And that's quite frightening. But if we ignore the fringes of the conspiracy theorists, who are people who say, no, it doesn't exist, they go into complete denial. And then there are others at the other end who are preparing for the end of the world. But within those, within everybody, I think there are 4 major, we can all be put into 4 groups. And there are those who want to return to the old normal. I'm afraid I don't think that is possible. I think it no longer exists. I think the old normal is what allowed the pandemic to be so devastating. Now, the word is difficult to describe because normal means I want to go back to the freedom I had before. You can do that, but it's not going to be the same. The next camp of people say, yep, we'll go back to what we were, but we accept that there must be adjustments. We accept that certain things cannot be the same. We then go to the camp of people who said, no, keep the lockdown, keep the restrictions, it works. But that's impossible. That's when you start having deep mental stress. And people need to interact, humans need to interact, and different cultures, particularly the Omani one that I love, it is very sociable, it is very social, it's very tactile. We look at people, we touch, we see. We can't do it very well in a manner that is divorced. And then I think you get to the point where accept all those to a certain extent, but learn and adapt. So we take the 3 and we apply the factors which in some ways are diametrically opposed. We must employ the extremes of technology and innovation, which many people are doing. When this thing started, my mother was struggling with a fax machine. Now she has an iPad, she does Zoom calls, she does all sorts of things, and she's 90 years old. That is a fantastic indication of how people can adapt, and that's what we must do. The key to everything, I believe, is communication. It is the most important part of human survival. If you take the newborn baby, they will cry simply because they need to be fed or they're uncomfortable. They are communicating their needs. And then for a person who has to describe his ailments to a doctor so the doctor can prescribe the best medicine. Then you have the diplomat who communicates to avoid war or to increase trade. And finally, you have the leader who must be able to communicate his message in order for people to understand and for them to follow. So human communication started with the spoken word, then the written word. And that was a significant point because it changed the memory as the default for remembering our culture and heritage. Now, perhaps the internet, the cloud, a lot of our memory has gone into that as a reference. But not much changed in communication in terms of voice for millions of years. We started trying one or two things, like we communicated by flag, but it was only what you can see. We couldn't get beyond the horizon, and people used mirrors. And then at one point, we suddenly evolved. But having said that, that form of communication is still useful. We see this every day. This is useful communication. It doesn't need technology other than someone standing there saying, slow down, it's dangerous. And if you wish, a traffic light is a form of communication. It's telling you, it's giving you a message. But nothing really changed until the metal cable, which allowed us to transmit a signal. First, a signal which allowed a code. We used Morse code. Then we managed to transmit a voice, and then even an image. And finally, we got to the point where we went beyond the cable into radio, and then fairly quickly, in human evolution terms, to the internet. And that's where we are now. We can do everything. In theory, all of these communications are available to everybody, but we know that there is inequality. And this is where, to build a more equal society than a region, than a world, we need to make sure that communication is accessible to everybody. Not just so that they can chat on WhatsApp and Facebook, it's so that we can evolve our systems whereby everybody has a medical record and that can be communicated. So an accident happens in Pondicherry, the guy hurt, he has a medical card. The medics take the number and they can access his medical records. They can see if he's got an allergy to a certain medicine. This is what I mean by having global communication. We've got to get together. And that is the common denominator. And once everybody has super fast broadband, we'll be equal. But even before that, it's helping other people. And you can remember the days of the frustrating calls through a copper wire with a crackling, broken signal. And I'm going to tell you an anecdote here. When I was based at Iski, not far from Niswa, to call my mother, I would have to drive to Niswa. I'd have to book a call at the Niswa motel, pay for it by American Express, which I only ever used for that. And after an hour or so, they'd put me through and I would have a crackling call to my mother. So that would take 5 hours probably by the time I'd got there and everything else. Everything's changed, and that is very good. So looking at change, what are the opportunities then for beneficial change? Change has to happen. Let's make it, as much as we can, good. So if we accept the premise that the pandemic has changed something vital, look at the opportunities. What good can we take from the situation? And again, I will take, I think, 4 points. Those are what I believe are possibly the key elements. Health and hygiene, work practice refinement, understanding how fragile we were, and then focusing on resilience, medium, long term. So for health and hygiene, we need to look at global health, I think. If you think about it, the pandemic was all about health. it was a virus which was transmitted from animals to humans, but we are actually from the animal kingdom. Most health problems stem from hygiene. If we don't wash properly, we have problems. You remember traveling, how many meetings did you go to and the guy said, oh, I've got a terrible cold, or I've got a stomach upset. All this is not personal hygiene, but the fact that we touch everything that everybody else touches. And COVID has shown that the added hygiene has helped. But this is where a cultural thing really helps. In the Islamic world, it has been less because of the part of the culture, which is the wudu. Before you pray, you wash. Muslims are much cleaner than other people, and the transmission rate is much lower, which is, I find, hugely fascinating. But this aspect of we've got to get to a point where everybody understands. And long after the developed countries have controlled the pandemic, it will still devastate the less fortunate, the less well-developed, and particularly those with less robust health systems. I mean, even the strongest medical system in the world, I mean, Britain has a very good system, but we suffered hugely. Oman has a wonderful system, but it suffered. Now, even with the good system, you put that situation in a country which has a very fragile health system, and that's why we have such huge problems for these poor people. So this is what we need to help once we've developed back into somewhere where we can move forward. One that is perhaps most interesting and relates to exactly what we're doing now is the work practice refinement. We are in a fascinating change. Future video conferencing is going to stay. Certainly, working remotely will stay to a certain extent because the value has been proven. I have managed to do 80% of my business via the internet, via telephone video conferencing. The 20% that I've missed is actually the most important, sadly, because that's talking to people and developing friendships and getting to trust people further. And that's the big downside. But there must be a balance between the two. And the other thing is that virtual reality is not real. There's a recent study from Stanford University, which provided evidence that there is Zoom fatigue. And if you do 5 or 6 Zoom calls a day, it's exhausting. But I would say, is it any more exhausting than driving for 4 hours a day to go to 4 meetings and driving 4 hours back? It's a balance. I mean, in Muscat, if I was doing 4 meetings, say, one in Rui, one in Kurum, one in Rusail, and then maybe one coming back to Al Quds somewhere, that's probably 2-3 hours driving, a little bit more. Then there's the situation with traffic, finding a parking space. It's a balance. So I'm not sure that that premise that Zoom fatigue is worse is necessarily true, simply different. But what we miss is with a telephone call, you can walk around. Here, I need to be in front of the screen to be able to do the presentation. If I'm presenting on a stage, I can walk around a bit, I can move. At a meeting, we can go around, we can talk to people, we can stand up, we can move to a whiteboard. Concept is different. And the other thing is that this is what we miss. This is what we see. Okay, it's slightly exaggerated, but if I was standing here or any of you were standing in front of this audience, you could see them. And as you're talking, there's a reaction. And there, the presenter, the photographer has clearly said something. And you have this wonderful reaction. And it's great. And it's rather nice that with the Majlis Al Khonji, the quality is so good, but you could imagine this sort of situation, which I have done. And, you know, there are crackly voices and everything else. And it is absolutely exhausting because you really can't see what's going on. You can't hear people. And that, again, is something that we must make sure we need to move from. The sustained eye contact with the screen. I mean, if you think about it, I'm here, I'm alone. I'm here looking at a television in a way, and yet wonderfully to overcome the pandemic situation, I'm in contact with you, but it's not the same as if we were sharing dates and coffee. and sitting down and talking about all the wonderful things about Oman. It misses the vital bit of human contact, and importantly, the cultural image. When I bring companies to Oman, I say to them, the culture of Oman is different, but it is absolutely not a barrier. It is a wonderful thing, but we need to enjoy it. And I'll show you. And it's always such a pleasure to see people thinking, gosh, I didn't know that. How very nice. I can now see it. And this is what we miss. And at the moment, 90% of training, all training is online, 70% through Teams. But what people are doing is to try to make the interaction more interesting. So what they're doing is they're employing games. They're gamifying the situation. So instead of having that awful screen that you can see there, you'll actually have people. So when the screen, someone talks, that person zooms into you. You can move around a table. You can have the faces around a table that you're looking at. People can move around. Again, it's still virtual reality, but it makes it slightly more interactive. And I think that is a way that could be of interest for the future. But it'll never get away from the face-to-face. Another thing I'm doing is I'm working with a company that does adaptive virtual reality. So you literally have the virtual reality headset on, and you can put any situation. It's mainly for the moment being used by the police for security training, but it can be used for anything, hazardous materials, checkpoints, even to teach receptionists in hotels how to react to customers. So the options are endless. One of the problems is, going back to that first group of people who just want to get back to normality, is that human beings don't always react very well to change. And going back to the 19th century, H.G. Wells, an author who was way ahead of his time, he said that it takes 50 years for humans to accept change, or leave it till the next century. Now, that's a bit gloomy, and this is where I would say the opportunity of the COVID pandemic allows us to accelerate that rapidly. It's already happened, and it's happening, but we must maintain it even after the restrictions are lifted. There is so much we can take forward from this. And we can avoid quite a lot of this, which is something which is devastating. I have a good friend, lots of good friends in Oman, and I can be waiting to meet, and then the guy will phone me and say, I'm going to be 10 minutes late, I'm stuck in traffic. Okay, he arrives 10 minutes later, but 15 minutes longer after he's found a parking place. That is not unique to any particular city. It is unique to humans. And think of the pollution, think of the stress. Most of those cars have one or two people in them. Logically, it doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. So what I would really like to do is to propose an idea which allows a return to some normality, but takes what we have, takes it forward. So if we look at a scenario, basic business scenario, there are two parties. One has a need, one has the product to sell. What happens? First, you agree that you're going to discuss the business. So the heads meet, the chief people, the decision makers meet to see if they like each other. That's great. You then have a couple more meetings, and then you have a long series of meetings, which could last a year, of contracts, tenders, legal documents, project management, structures, and everything else. 80% of the whole interaction is that bit. And then at the end, the leaders come back, verify their trust, and decide that they will conclude. Now, let's have a look at how in the past that would have been done probably 90% face-to-face. Phone calls, internet, certainly, but all of the coordinating meetings would have been done face-to-face. What it misses now in the future is this bit, and this is the bit that we must have. So if we then look at a process of adoption, this is my proposal, this is my idea. So the situation that I looked at, we look at the project launch, we then look at the project management, and then the conclusion. Probably the launch is 10%. That is when the decision makers say, I like this, I like your product, we can do business, fantastic. The 80% in the middle, I suggest could be largely remote. Could be. It's not a figure that would be imposed, but it's just, that is an idea. And then at the end, we must come to the face-to-face again to reaffirm the trust, reaffirm that you want to do business. But what would be nice, going back to the slide of the Omanis having coffee and dates, make the 10% at the front and the end much more sociable. Why do we need to go to an office? Let's go straight out for lunch. Let's get to know people socially. Let's get to see if we can trust them. Because after all, it's all about trust and a relationship. It's not about your office. It's about the person. Once we've established that, we can then do a great deal remote. And I was traveling, I was doing probably 50 flights a year and traveling, I don't know, 100,000 kilometers by car for business. In the last year, I have been no more than 10 kilometers from my house. And yet I've achieved, if you wish, the 80%. What I've missed, perhaps, is the 10% at the end. But I will catch up by the end of this year. But the fact is, I have proven that that is a possibility. And that's what I find interesting, but won't necessarily be everybody's idea of how we go forward. But there must be some sort of compromise whereby we reduce travel, we reduce stress, we reduce time, and we make our practice more efficient. That is, it's simply my view. At the same time, we need to look perhaps to see if the management structure can cope with a varied evolution. And again, it's just my view, but where I have worked with companies that have what we call a flat line management, this process of where it's quite hard to find a decision maker, it's quite hard to find a structure of a project, and it's very hard to work with them because it's much better that we work perhaps one-to-one. And if you take another situation which I find better is what's called the top line down management. So that's the person in charge, quite clear, and they deal with these two, and they deal with these three, and it goes down from there. That is the structure of the animal kingdom, which is what we are. No animal structure works without a structure. You know, a pack of lions has one dominant male. A pack of elephants has somebody who's dominant. That's the way it works. We are simply an evolution of that. We work better if there is one person in charge and it's quite clear who reports to him where and who does what. Now, I know that from your extensive experiences, you know that very well, but sometimes we lose the structure. And again, this may be a good opportunity to look at how we can improve. And as an example, in the First World War, the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, his cabinet, his war cabinet, was 4 people. He said, I need someone who deals with manpower, somebody who deals with industry, somebody who deals with munitions, and somebody who deals with food. I'm not interested in anything else. If I get those right, we'll win the war. If I'm bothering about roads in Scotland, I don't have time. And that was, I think, an example which may be interesting. So, having identified what we might refine, we need to understand how we can then move forward. And to understand that, we need to see how fragile we are. We need to identify what went wrong. And nobody is without blame. We allowed things to happen, which perhaps were inevitable, but perhaps we should look at making sure it doesn't happen again. So, what went wrong last time? Firstly, health. You know, the health was a problem. We were not ready for a pandemic. whatever anybody says. You remember the days when in England, we ran out of ventilators, we ran out of oxygen, we ran out of test kits. We didn't have any vaccine at all. We were not ready. And yet, in 2018, the United Kingdom practiced for a pandemic, wrote a plan, and it was number 2 on the list of likely catastrophes that would strike the United Kingdom. And even with that plan, we got it wrong. And the reason we got it wrong was that decision points were not maintained. For a strategic plan to work, there will be points when you say, I've got to do this now in order for this to happen. If I don't do that, this decision point gets delayed. And it comes to the point where there are no decision points left. And that's what happened, no question of it. So the health system must be robust. After all, we are all human and we need health. Nowadays, people are much healthier, and that gives us a sense of a false sense of security, because we think we are much healthier than we are. We're not. We're vulnerable. Everybody is. The next thing that collapsed, perhaps, or perhaps that's too strong a word, is finance. And perhaps our entire financial structure is far too weak. I mean, I am not a financial person at all. So my take is probably that of a child, but it looks to me like 90% of money doesn't exist. The 10% of money that does exist goes to pay the workers. The 90% is gambled by people and mostly it has enormous benefits to the world, but it takes very little for that confidence to be maintained. So when Donald Trump or somebody else says something, the stock markets tumble. And that will put 500,000 people out of work globally. That is the impact from one statement. That is far too fragile to be resilient. We must have a system whereby if things happen, the impact is far less. I mean, ideally, we should go back to the gold standard, but that doesn't work. But for me, the thought of my wealth being on a memory chip somewhere is quite scary. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, I appreciate what I've just said, but the point is we need to make our finances more resilient, otherwise we can't pay people, and therefore we can't build the economy back. The national emergency planning was not robust enough, or in the case of the United Kingdom, and I'll be completely open, the political will wasn't there because the political will was too democratically oriented towards party political things rather than the good of the country. And I think that was the same in most of Europe. We have to focus then on resilience. What do we as people, businessmen, what do we need to do? We need to make sure we have consolidated what we have. We need to then look at how do we make sure we're stronger and then grow over the next 3 to 5 years. As a country, all countries, we've got to make sure that if the pandemic comes back, it doesn't crucify us again. So we need to have a health system which has vaccines. Research is always going on to find out what we might need next. Practice scenarios, right, let's have a look and see if there's a new virus strain coming out of South Africa, South America. What could it be? Do we have the ability to adapt vaccines and then build stocks of vaccines to cater for it? Do we have hospitals which can cater for thousands of beds extra with ventilators, with oxygen and everything else? Do we have the capacity to deal with the mental health issues that come out of COVID, which will last for the next 10 years? That is part of resilience. Because even if you're strong in the central point, if you're spending 10% of all your money on catering for the people who are suffering from mental health issues, then you're not going to progress very quickly. I know that Oman is addressing the financial issues very, very carefully, very sensibly. And seeing what His Majesty Sultan Haytham is doing is extraordinary. It's wonderful to see. He's doing things at personal cost to him. And the cuts are hurting everybody and not a single element of society. And it is, for me, seeing it as something of an outsider, it is very encouraging and something that other people can learn from. The other thing is our infrastructure of every country needs to be sound. We need to remember the basics of what we need, which is we need water, we need food, we need shelter, we talked about health, we need employment. To have employment, we need money. We need an industry to grow. That is the infrastructure. Then on top of that, we have the security, the defense that makes it safe. That is important. And a key element of that is the internet. We will not work without the internet in the future. All of those systems I've mentioned, you know, the distribution of water, food, shelter, electricity, everything will become smart. And I've been working with some Omani companies and talking about smart systems for nearly 20 years of how do you bring in everything, whether it's traffic management, security, food distribution, water distribution, health. You know, a hospital is becoming overwhelmed. Right, it needs to press a button and it warns another hospital, how many beds do you have? Great, we've got 10. And we can just automatically divert ambulances to the right place. That has to happen. And it is. It's very exciting. But the internet is very fragile at the moment. We are really in the early days of it. It is terribly fragile. And you look at what happened literally in the last few days, you know, in America. I mean, that has, I don't know how much that's going to cost America and thus the world, but a cyber attack basically shut down 40% of America's fuel supply overnight. And as the president said, you know, that is our lifeline. This is our jugular. And it was a pretty determined attack. It worked. Now, unless they have a system whereby they can bypass everything that was shut down, they're in trouble. We have to accept that. And then there are existential things. We haven't got away from terrorism. Terrorism is there. And this is the time that the people who disagree with our way of life may try to disrupt it. And I chose this book deliberately because Dr. Warren, in it, he mentions specifically Oman. And he said Oman is the least involved in the world of providing Islamic fighters. And he said this is directly due to the robust nature of the society and the extraordinary leadership of His Majesty. And he mentions that clearly in his book. And I find it fascinating because it emphasizes to me the importance of Oman nationally, regionally, and globally. Something else which I don't want to frighten you, and I'm sure you know about it, but solar flares are on their way. And even in 1859, a solar flare disrupted the electrical grids of several countries in Europe, and the communication cables were destroyed. That's in 1859. The most recent one, perhaps, is the 1989 blackout in Canada, where a solar flare shut down part of Canada. Now, 1989 was before internet, effectively. A solar flare could have an enormous effect on the internet. GPS. So planes traveling in a corridor, their GPS navigation system could be shifted 5 kilometers west, which puts them into another air corridor. And you can understand the implications of that. But they are known and they can be protected. But everybody has to be part of that team. So any weak area of internet becomes a doorway to affect everybody. There's also a possibility of a meteorite landing, but there's very little we can do about that, and we can predict it several hundred years in advance. So I think we can probably leave that one for the moment. Once we've identified the threats, we can start protecting against them. We can start building resilience, and we can start coming out of the problem at a run. We don't have to crawl out of it. We can start running before it's even there. There is the aspect that we're going to suddenly become very wealthy. Every time there has been a crisis going back hundreds of years, there has always been a massive boost to GDP. In France in the 1830s, there was a cholera epidemic which killed 3% of Paris in a month. It was devastating for the country. The doctors just didn't know how to cope with it. But what followed was an enormous increase in everything. The Industrial Revolution started and everything else. But on the downside, there was uncertainty. A lot of people spent their savings. A lot of people were waiting to buy things. And this is what's happening everywhere in the world. We must make sure that, and what happens in all these things, the rich get much richer and the poor get much poorer. But I don't see that happening because people now know it. And the country I see it happening last, honestly, is Oman, because the equality element is far more advanced than many other countries I've seen. So even as COVID rages, particularly sadly across the poorer countries, we are on the verge of a post-pandemic boom. Governments are lifting the restrictions in Europe. Vaccinations are up to nearly 50% in the UK. Hospitalizations are down everywhere, including Oman, by a long way. What we need to do now is to ensure that we lead the positive change. It's looking like, I mean, the forecast of the IMF at the moment is that the US, sorry, I'm just going to go back one for a moment. United States GDP will grow by 6% this year, which is extraordinary for a country that size. But it's unlikely to be sustainable. There will be a blip, and then other aspects. I mean, there will be huge re-employment, but that growth of employment can't be sustained. So it'll be a blip, and then it'll fall. That is when the uncertainty returns. That is when we go back to a situation which is challenging. So we need to look at what do we do? We've looked at the health, we looked at finance, we need security. We mentioned, the threat of terrorism doesn't go away. Leadership is there. Ease of business we've discussed. Were the ways we were doing business before too fragile, too time consuming, too outdated? Do we need to have that methodology? Have we shown that we can actually move forward and do something better? Once we've looked at everything, we have to make them strong. It's not just ideas that we bandy around. They've got to be depth. We've got to have the confidence and the depth that whatever happens, however hard we're hit, we're not going to break. Oman needs to open for business. I mean, it's wonderful to see all the things on LinkedIn, tourism and everything else. But people will come when they're confident that it's safe, and that should not be difficult. The United Nations frequently describes Oman as one of the safest countries in the world, and I don't think that's changed. But there may be people who wish to exploit that, to try to disrupt it. I spent a lot of time in my life doing anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism, and the clear element of some of the terrorist ideologies is to strangle what they consider their enemies financially. And it doesn't take much. You remember the attack at Sharm el-Sheikh? It killed tourism. The effect was devastating for years. And that is, I mean, Paris has had the same, London's had the same. When the terrorist attacks happened in London, the United Kingdom will lose £10 billion in tourism in the following year. That's a given. So that is what is forecast for the G7 over the next year, the 21 forecast. It's incredible, and it may well happen, but I doubt it'll happen in 2022 or 2023. So we need to be prepared for the uncertainty and be able to cater for a lack of confidence that follows. But looking at Oman, if you look at today in the paper, Hajj bin Mohammed is doing an incredibly good job in streamlining many of the things that I have said, and I know that he will do it in the time allocated, and it'll be done very well. The decrees by His Majesty Sultan Haytham, for me, are very wise, and they can be done. The great thing about Oman is that I have seen the ability to overcome legacy and to say, well, actually, we need to overcome this. We're not bothering with this fence, we're going to jump it. And if you look at the situation now, I mean, I'm having Zoom calls with my Omani friends who wouldn't answer their mobile phones 2 years ago. They waited to see me, which was always a pleasure. But now I'm having Zoom calls with them. I'm having coffee and dates with them over a Zoom call. That is an acceleration that is far faster than the uptake in Europe. The uptake in Europe, that speed of progression took 30 years in Europe, and it's taken 3 in Oman. It's incredible. I mean, I was introduced to WhatsApp by a 70-year-old Omani man, and I love it. I think that is fantastic. Very, very exciting. The other thing where I think Oman has the enormous strength and will help investment, confidence, and everything else is the position of neutrality, the position of having no enemies, only friends, and the extraordinary soft power of diplomacy. And I just use one example here. Although it says quite clearly Saudi Arabia reaches out to Oman, they wouldn't do that unless there was the willingness and the long-term strategy, diplomacy by Oman to make it happen. And I find that incredibly exciting. Oman understands it very well. And although Oman has been hit very badly, it will overcome, it will prevail, and it's because of the ability to adapt and the incredible leadership, which for me gives me the confidence that Oman is going to be one of the first to go ahead, not just for a year or two with a GDP blip, but in the greater longer term, because she will learn the mistakes. She'll build on the strength that she perhaps didn't have before and become a great deal stronger for it. So that is really all I have to say at the moment. I haven't drawn breath, and I hope it's been of interest. I'm very, very happy to take questions, but I would also just like to say once more, Eid Mubarak to you and your families, and thank you very much for listening, and I hope it was of interest. Your Excellency, Mike, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Mr. Mike, over to you, please.
Thank you, Rehan. Thank you, Matt. You've covered a lot of ground, talking about harnessing value, opportunities for beneficial change, building resilience, and leading for the future. Actually, it's almost too much for one person to handle these days. There's so many issues. So if I may start with a question to you, please.
Of course.
But what qualities do you think, what top 3 qualities, for example, do you think leaders need today to thrive in all this uncertainty, all this complexity? How do they collaborate? How do they work with others? What are the qualities that we should be looking for to really harness the opportunity of the future?
If I could answer that quickly, I would be in charge of the British Army and probably the Prime Minister. It is a very, very good question, an exceptional question, and I will do my very best to answer it. Leadership is a very complicated thing. I would say 3 things that are important. I would say the leader must know what he's talking about. He must have knowledge. He needs to have the depth of understanding. And with the example of His Majesty Sultan Haytham, he has an enormous depth of education, understanding, intelligence, and experience. He knows the country, he knows the system, he understands political science. He went to Oxford to learn it, and he has had an extraordinary career in understanding. So I would put knowledge of the country, the people, and everything as a key factor. The other one is the ability to communicate, because however clever and knowledgeable you are, if you can't put your message across to people in a way that's compelling, they're not going to follow you. I had the privilege to go to Sandhurst, and the general representing the Queen said something quite simply. He said, "Come on is a better order than go on." So communication enables you to lead from the front. You say, this is what we need to do. I'm going, you need to follow me. And that's part of it, I think. And finally, of the 3,000 we could talk about quite happily, I would say courage. He's got to have the ability to make decisions which are very difficult. He's got to have the ability to overcome opposition to his ideas, and there always is. There are many clever people who have different views, different experiences, different interests. So he must have the courage to say, this is what we need to do. I'm going to do it. You follow me, come hell or high water. So knowledge, the ability to communicate, and courage, I suggest, are not the only three, but perhaps important ones at this moment in time.
So if I could just lead on from that, and then if I could open to our other friends and colleagues here. But what about some thoughts on having an ability to hold short-term views as well as long-term views? And through that combination, looking at how to enable teams to collaborate and work faster, because most time horizons that we seem to look at now, I remember 30 years back preparing project proposals with a 10-year horizon. Today, it's pretty hard to look 1 year out. So what comments might you make in that direction, please?
Again, very interesting, and COVID has shown that we've got to have the ability to achieve things in the short term. It's very easy to say, oh, we'll have a 30-year plan, great. But if we don't start it now, i.e. deal with the short-term things, it always remains a long-term plan. And the longest vision of any country in the Middle East, as far as I can make out quite easily, is Oman. Nobody has a vision going out to 2040. And yet that's quite soon. A lot of very short-term decisions need to be taken very quickly to ensure that the medium plan goes into action and then the long plan. And that takes courage. It's very easy to say, oh, I'll put that off till next year. We'll have a planning session in 2023 and we'll see what happens then. No, you need to make the decision next week. So to achieve this, let's say, internet security for the whole country before, let us say, next Ramadan, you need to make a decision next Monday about what systems you're going to start researching. You need to have them in place by, let's say, the 1st of September. So I would say at the moment, short term is probably more important than medium and long.
Okay, but going through my notes of your very good presentation, but you put internet certainly high up the list, but your number one priority was health and hygiene. So turning to health, what would the objective be short term for most countries? Now, what would be the objective they have to work towards in direction of health for the population?
Very good. That is everything, and I still take it as the first priority. But everybody knows about health. We know what to do with health. We've been doing that for thousands of years. We've simply forgotten what to do. Pandemics have happened before. People have got ill. People have been told to wash themselves, be clean with food. Hospitals have been told to prepare for pandemics, epidemics, everything else. We don't have to relearn that. We just have to remind ourselves where we got it wrong. So I would have a massive program which started last week to make sure that people wash themselves, clean themselves, that hospitals are robust, test the hospitals. Say, look, okay, well done. You've got empty beds now. What's your plan for when the beds fill up next Thursday? Where's your plan? What are you doing about it? I want a plan tomorrow. Make it happen. And put out to schools, yes, we're coming out of restrictions, but clean yourselves, wash yourselves, clean your hands, wear masks if you're worried. Absolutely, I would have a national regional health plan which just stopped people catching stuff, whether it be a cold, flu, gastroenteritis, or something far worse. So yes, absolutely. Internet is something we're still learning.
Thank you, Matt. I've had you for long enough, so if I could hand over to Reham for someone else to have an opportunity to speak with you. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Matt, Mr. Mike. We will listen now to some questions. We have Dr. Ramin. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Reham. Thank you, Mike. وكل عام وانتم بخير مقدما. Matt, thank you for a very informative and well done on sort of making such a precise presentation and nailing quite a few spots on the head and getting the point through. Thank you. My point is, by the way, I think when H.G. Wells said about the 50 years of change, he was talking about a generation. And due to technology and everything else, generation which used to be 30 to 50 years is now more like 5 years. And hence the speed of change and uncertainty, as you pointed out. I think a lot of people, a lot of countries, a lot of organizations are dealing with COVID as if there's going to be a golden era afterwards. And COVID wasn't the first catastrophe or pandemic in the world, and I don't think it's going to be the last. So the way we face things or try to solve things, I think should be much more holistic and looking at it from a macro level rather than going into the details. And just for the clarity of my own head, I want to divide it into two. One would be a local or a national level, and the other one would be an international one. And I think if we look at the local and the national, leadership, which was part of your title, should really be also maybe passed on or taught to everybody in society. I'm talking about junior youth, I'm talking about youth, I'm talking about everybody in society in order to take responsibility. Now, any society that the people took responsibility for what was happening with COVID, for example, we wouldn't have been where we are now. We would have been in a lot better position. So a lot of the things was that people, individuals think leadership is something you throw on one poor person that has to bear the weight for the whole country, which is really not the case, I think. So giving responsibility or taking responsibility by society, individuals actually working towards building society, working on things like ethics, like equality, like education, like transparency. I think these elements are what's going to, you are absolutely right about the short term, but I think about the long term, these are the things that are really going to build society and prepare us for something that we couldn't possibly be prepared for in the future. No matter how much brainstorming we do, there's no way we can predict what's going to happen in 2, 5, 10, 20 years. At an international level, I think the world is very much reactive, even to this day. And I think one of the ways that leadership at the global level could see or prevent these, or make us live through the uncertain times in a positive building way is when the world becomes proactive. So all these cooperations that happen after a disaster has happened should really be done before. All these help that we as in humans, not Oman. When we as humans see a catastrophe in one part of the world, and suddenly the world rushes to help India or anybody else, that should be done, you know, in a cooperative, let's call it global peace, call it world peace. But peace isn't just a paper that people sign. I'm talking about real harmony, cooperation, proactiveness. And I think solving or trying to solve all the issues that we've seen in the past few months or a year through the same methodologies and solutions that we've been doing since the 1990s and 80s and 70s and so on, isn't really going to stop us facing them again. Our solutions and the whole cycle of a solution should be thought out of the box, if you like, and not built on the methodologies that we used in the past. Thank you. I just thought to share my things that went through my mind through your brilliant presentation. Thank you.
I'm very flattered that you say that. That's a fascinating series of ideas, and I agree entirely. I just want to go back to you with H.G. Wells. He was actually talking about England at that point. He hadn't really got international, despite his very wide education. And you're absolutely right. He was talking about an era and a generation. And you then mentioned the golden era that people are thinking is going to happen. For some, it will. There will be a sudden boom, and people will say, look, but it won't happen for many people, and it'll be short-lived. And my point about, you know, those who want to go back to normality, I think those are the ones that are looking at this golden era and thinking, that's what we had before, it was brilliant. Well, I look at the past and I think I had some wonderful memories, but I also have some memories that it wasn't all that good. There were bits that I would prefer not to change in the past. You can't change memories, but there were bits and pieces of my life that I would prefer that my son did not have to experience. So going on to what you said about building individual responsibility is absolute. It is totally right, because you see there are people that sat back and said, it's not my responsibility. It's nothing to do with me. Somebody will come and help me if I need help. Instead of saying, what can I do? Exactly as you said. And people need to take individual responsibility. Without that, we have a society that is so fragile that it can break so easily. And I agree entirely that leadership is the responsibility of absolutely everybody. And taking your point also on the ethics and education, this is all about culture as well. And this is where I find Oman has such a head start on everybody. The culture, the heritage, the traditions are so deep that when you see it, it is incredible. And I'm embarrassed. I see young European children behaving pretty badly. And then you see, I go and meet an Omani friend, and his children, immaculately dressed, will come and greet me in a traditional manner, entirely politely, with confidence. And that's where it starts. It's totally agree with you. And that is what develops the robustness, which creates resilience nationally. And then you moved on to international leadership. Yes, we cannot exist as a group of 186 countries all trying to be nationalistic. We've got to be able to say we are simply part of a world team which ensures that peace, as you very rightly said, is real and not just a piece of paper, not just a treaty. I mean, we do have systems. We have, the World Health Organization. We have UNESCO for protecting heritage. We have United Nations for trying to stop wars or do something, but they're not part of the leadership team. It's almost like it's an agency that is harnessed when leadership fails. It should be part of the team, or it should be the team, just as a thought. But I agree with everything you say. But the key element is normality is finished. The new normal has to be a building block for future resilience through robustness. And I feel that culture is a key to it. I really do. Thank you very much, Dr. Rahman.
Thank you.
I hope
Thank
that answers some of your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rahman, Mr. Matt. Mr. Matt, we will just take a couple of questions, if that's okay, so that you can answer later after we take a couple of questions. So listen now to Engineer Saleh Al-Shamfari, following by Dr. Nada Al-Ajmi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for a very, very informative and deep understanding as well as debate that is made. I've enjoyed your talk very, very much. And I want to go back to your, connotation about the leadership traits, in addition to the three, dimensions that you have referred to. How could you relate emotional intelligence and a deep cultural inclusiveness and understanding into the whole process? As in today's, one of the major threats with the new technology that is separating us physically and the use of virtual realities, the inability to physically and visually understand and meet the people and read their expressions would need an extra qualities of leadership that will allow you as a leader to be more capable of managing the emotional side as well as a cultural side, coupled with the other three major dimensions that you referred to. So please comment on this, because I really face these multidimensional cultural emotional intelligence issues in our group almost in a daily fashion. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Rehan, would you like me to answer that,
Yeah.
or did you say there's a few questions?
Yes, if I can just take Dr. Nada's question, then you can answer both of them. Dr. Nada?
Thank you, Riham, and thank you, Matt, for the presentation. And I clearly see everyone is heading towards one question or one direction, which is the importance of collaboration and that sense of unity that we need as humanity. But I was thinking that it's also worth it to celebrate where we have come because of this pandemic. It's very evident that increase of consciousness of our duty to serve humanity has risen in the past, well, let's say year, and that capacity has given expression more through the act of services, whether we see in the medical field or how people stand by each other and support each other. Yet we find that habit or contest or self-interest, prejudice or closed-mindedness still remains more of a hindering factor towards achieving that unity. So my question is, how can we enhance our greater acceptance of humanity's inherent oneness, especially as leaders, especially people who are in leadership position and they need to take decisions? Thank you.
Yeah, Mr.
Thank you very much indeed.
We can
Two
answer
fascinating questions. Sorry, Rehan, I interrupted.
Yeah, please go ahead. You can answer both, and then we will carry on with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Salman Shanfari and Dr. Nada. Thank you. Very, very excellent questions and incredibly difficult to answer, but I will do my very best. Emotional intelligence in leadership is vital. I mean, it is the way that leaders work, is to understand the human condition and to lead from that standpoint. Without the human contact, it becomes incredibly difficult. And the only way I can think about it is just to start shouting. I know it sounds incredibly childish, but I've had situations where soldiers are doing something and they're being led by the radio because that's the only way. It's over a large area. And the leader in question, and you may know him or may know of him and seen him, was at the time Colonel Mike Jackson, who was an incredibly dynamic leader. He ended up as the chief of the general staff. And he used to get people motivated by just shouting down the radio, forgetting all protocols, just shouting at them. And that worked. When I started in the army, my troop sergeant said to me, right, sir, the only way you're going to get the soldiers to like you is to go out and shout at them every day. Otherwise, they don't feel wanted. It's the human contact. And that is a fairly brutal way of understanding emotional intelligence and the human condition. But it is getting people to feel that they're part of the team. Something very hard to do if you're not actually sticking your hand on their shoulder and saying, well done, or no, that wasn't what I wanted you to do. I need you to do this. Doing it in 2 dimensions is much harder to get your character across, your feelings across. The only way, I think, is to personalize it. You say, okay, look, I need to talk to you, and you give the guy a call and perhaps do one-to-one video, that sort of thing. And I'm really making this up as I go along. It is very, very hard to put your leadership qualities through a barrier, which is the internet. But it is essential. And it is, I mean, Omani culture is all about being there, touching, looking, seeing the person, looking into their heart, their soul, and saying, do I want to work with this person? Do I trust them? Do I like them? And you can't fully achieve that through an electronic screen. So it is something that artificial intelligence may help. And there's going to be an awful lot of increased reliance on robotics, an awful lot more increased reliance on the artificial intelligence of being able to identify faces, to identify emotions. But I think it's, until you put a human stomach into a computer and give him a tummy bug and see how the computer brain reacts when you're feeling pretty rotten, you're never going to get any emotion out of a computer. And facial expressions, I mean, when I see someone, there are 1,000 expressions that may or may not be identified in the first 10 minutes. They all mean something. A computer is not going to be able to identify the movement, the flicker of an eye, the eye movement at accessing cues, and the closing of one eye, the slight jerk of the head, the nod at the wrong time, the immediate body language reaction. Not for many years. Hopefully by then we will have a compromise where we can manage more face-to-face. But it's an incredibly good question and an incredibly hard one to answer. I don't think I've got anywhere near doing it other than to acknowledge that it is a problem. And we should be working, as Mike's point, in the very short term to see how we can overcome it. Otherwise, we're not going to achieve the short and the medium term because we've just failed. We sit back in our boxes and we become isolated, which, if I could move on to Dr. Nada's point, collaboration is everything. We've got to collaborate to win. The duty to serve humanity is understood by most people. There was I noticed there was an article in the Institute for Management, Cambridge University, which said the top 10 or 20 billionaires have just increased their wealth by 17%, while the average worker, the salary has gone down by 7%. Now that is, and I replied to that saying that every crisis is absolutely personified by the incredible acts of kindness of the majority and the selfish acts of just a few. And to take your point, Dr. Nada, that is where we fail. We've got to build a more equal world. And we don't go to the point of, we're not all equal. Everybody has a different attribute to offer, and they should be respected for whatever it is they can contribute to all our societies. We've got to get away from the fact that, must be no bigotry, there must be no prejudice, accept that people have different things to offer, but make them inclusive, absolutely inclusive. So the act of serving, if they are cleaning the street, is known to them as a vital part of what we do. And then you extend that outside the country to the global element. And then we're going to get somewhere to achieve what we must do, which is to have a world that serves humanity and not itself. Anybody that is self-serving is part of the problem. I agree with you entirely, but it's a huge step to take, and it's one of the evils. It's greed, and we've got to overcome it, or allow them to be in a box where they don't interfere with other people. But it goes back to emotion and culture. Perhaps we don't have enough global culture. I don't think that's answered your question either, but it's just a response of some sort. But very, very interesting questions and very, very thought-provoking. And I will certainly give those a lot more thought because they really stimulate the old grey cells. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Matt. Dr. Talal Awlaqi.
Dr. Tao, can you turn your microphone on, please?
Yeah, we can't hear you, Dr. Talal. If you can just turn on your audio.
Oh, sorry, I was muting. So thank you very much for to Matt and to Mike and to you, Reham and Majlis Al Khonji. I was just trying to think about the current situation of COVID and how the scientists and economists become in the front line in signaling the communication to the societies. And in the case where we have it here, maybe in Oman and UK, there is what I noticed, the data is very complex. There is a national debt deficit, and in the same time, there is a disease with a very complex, uncertain characteristic that difficult to be simplified the communication to the societies. And you mentioned the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and I remember I've read in his biography that he established something they call it S branch, like a statistical branch that focusing on simplifying the charts of food supply and demand, and the critical decision need to be taken. My question to you, based on your diverse background on the army and onto also crisis mobilization, how can we? What is the learning in simplifying those complex data to the societies and as well to the decision makers? So there is an active dynamic decision can be taken. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tilal. That is it's a very key point. And I think a lot of people, which actually refers back to other questions, in that people did not wish to take responsibility because they simply didn't understand what was going on. And that is exactly right. And the most intelligent scientist is somebody who can explain something complicated in a way that's accessible to everybody. And a professor of technology explained three-dimensional printing to me in a way that I thought, oh, that's quite easy. It's a piece of cake, because he explained it without any resource to things which he knew I wouldn't understand, which is anything to do with maths and science. And that is the clever element. And I will take an example. I totally agree with Winston Churchill said, I need to make what I'm talking about accessible to people so they understand what I'm talking about. They're not interested in the fact that we dropped 47,000 trillion kilos of high explosive onto the reverse resource supply of the second echelons of the fourth shock army of means nothing. They just said, we carried out raids for 3 days and that will stop the war by probably 6 months. And people thought, oh, that was good. We understand that. And if you take, I'm afraid the British government was very guilty of what you said. You had the minister standing up and saying, if we can get the evolution of the R rate down to -1 by the point of the 3 months after 6 weeks after the first lockdown, then as long as the R rate doesn't go up to R+1 within 2 weeks, then we have achieved something. People thought, excellent, and then switched the channels and looked at something else on the television because they didn't understand. What they should have said is, if you don't wash your hands and touch surfaces which other people have touched and get too close to people, you're going to catch COVID and you might die and you might kill the rest of your family. Do you understand? That's it. Nobody understands COVID unless, I'm sure you do, but it needs somebody with intelligence to understand what it is. The average human, which I include myself, has no idea what COVID is. What we need to understand is what it does to me, what it does to my family, what it does to my country, and how do I help stop it? So the message is exactly what you say. It must be accessible to everybody, and brings in Dr. Nada's point that they then feel included. And it's good leadership. A good leader says very simply, this is what we need to do. I want you to follow me because it's in everybody's interest. And I hope that's possibly what you're saying. It's down to clear leadership. Say how it affects everybody, then they understand, then they're more willing to listen. Does that go some way to answer what you were saying?
Thank you very much, Matt. It's very enlightened and very informative feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mack, Dr. Talal. We'll move now to Lotus, then following by Mr. Khalil Al-Balushi.
Thank you so much for this really inspiring conversation. I have two questions. One is about the role of youth in all of this and the younger generations. So, we saw during the pandemic how creatively and with a really strong sense of purpose, the younger generations have risen up and contributed to all of this. So I wonder how leadership can tap into this capacity that the younger generations have. How can they mobilize the energy that's there towards this sort of collective consciousness and global prosperity that we were talking about? My second question is about how we can actually draw leadership lessons from communities or groups within society that we, don't automatically think about when we think of leadership. So, for example, I had heard about how in the Philippines, for example, the SMEs were much more adaptable and resilient when the crisis had hit, because they had that flexibility, because they were able to quickly change their operations to something different. Another example closer to home for us in Oman, so I work with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and being in contact with the farming community in the Sultanate. It's really inspiring how, despite the hardships and the restrictions, they were able to be truly resilient and find ways to connect to e-platforms or find other opportunities to basically feed us and keep us all sustained and have our well-being. So how can we draw leadership lessons from these communities where our traditional ways of thinking don't draw from this grassroots knowledge to inform our leadership, because there's a wealth of knowledge there that we can, utilize within, non-traditional forms of leadership.
Very, very good. That is two excellent points. I love the point about youth. Youth is everything. If you think about it, and I go back to the army. I mean, most armies are age between 18 and 30. Most of those are between 18 and 22. They do a good job. Most young entrepreneurs who are going to succeed are 21 to 24. The biggest problem is people like me, my generation, who think we were better. The greatest thing with youth is to let them be young, but teach them to be adult. So give them responsibility as early as possible. Let them make mistakes, but give them the opportunity to try. I look at all sorts of things every day, and the most exciting thing for me in when you see success is when it's a 23-year-old. And a 23-year-old who's a year out of university has come up with an idea and made it work because he's been inspired by something or someone to do it. And one example was the young Omani who started off playing with a remote control helicopter or something. And a year later, he had a business which had UAVs with cameras which helped the farming, which you mentioned. And it was able to identify problem areas in soil, which saves so much time of, instead of doing soil samples from 1,000 acres taking months, you could actually narrow down the search area to perhaps a couple of 100 square meters and saving months of time, energy, money, and being able to produce better food quicker. And that was exciting. So for youth, enable the youth as early as possible. Teach them the benefit of winning. And that works. If you win, you'll be successful. If you win, you're leading. So everything is about the youth. The youth is short, medium, long term, but it's everything. And instead of perhaps my generation struggling on and making mistakes, it's to hand over to the youth. I know what I want to do. I know roughly how to do it, but I want new ideas. I can help, I can guide, I can mentor, but I want the young people to be doing it because I get tired and I forget things, but I do have a depth of experience. But I want to pass that on. I want the youth to be leading right from their earliest possible age when they can. It is absolute. But your question about how do you mobilize them, enable them. That's all I would say. You need the government to enable the youth, not to treat them as youth. Oh, you'll be fine once you've had 20 years experience. No, forget the experience. I've got the experience. I'll give you that. Go and do something and go and do it right now. That would be my answer there. In drawing the leadership from other areas, it's brilliant because we're not seeking things which don't exist. We're ignoring things which exist, not using them properly. Your example of the Filipino industry that was able to adapt, fantastic. And in fact, that's also an example of the United States in the Second World War. They changed their entire industrial base from motor cars, razor blades, to weapons of war. Okay, it's sad that it had to happen, but the speed that they were able to do it was incredible because they were flexible and they had the leadership which told them to do it, enabled them, and got on with it. That is another example. The farmers, I mean, they must be the most resilient people in the world. They are people who spend all day, every day, nurturing, guiding, cultivating, praying that the crops will come up. They are tough people and they lead their people. They lead by planning. They had to plan. The farmer that takes his crop, sells it and sits down quite happily drinking coffee isn't going to have a crop next year. He's got to be planning tomorrow's crop as he picks today's crop. Huge leadership potential with farmers, I agree entirely. And without farmers, as you rightly say, we don't have any food. And Oman has such potential for agricultural growth. This is one of the projects I'm trying to work on, is because what Oman lacks is water. And although there are plans all over the place to bring water in, fantastic, but it's never going to be enough. So the more way we can harness water from air, improve desalination, bring it out of the clouds. I know they do it in Dhofar, they have nets. Anyway, sorry, I'm digressing. In terms of leadership from existing areas, yes, it's there, but we have to go and look for it and find it everywhere. There's a guy in Niswa Souk. He runs 3 shops. That's leadership. He's an entrepreneur. Go and talk to him and say, right, I want you to run 10 shops now. You need to become the syndicate leader for this area. Learn from him, sit with him. Yes, I totally agree with you. But it needs to be managed. I hope that goes some way to answer part of your 2 questions.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lotus. Mr. Matt, if you allow me just to take more free questions together, and then you can answer them. Mr. Khalil Al-Blushi, following by Mr. Simon Karam and Mr. Khamis. Please go ahead, Mr. Khalil.
Thank you, Riham. Thank you, Matt, for the interesting thoughts there. I will start with the title of the talk, when we say uncertainty. I know when things are bad, we say uncertainty, but here we are certain that it is going south. So things are bad from various aspects, be it from economy, health, and all that. So it is more of a complexity, a prolonged complexity. What to do with the health, it will affect trade and economy and vice versa and all that. I will go into the adaptability point. The initial revolutions, they used to take 80, 100 years, but it is more like a 20 year now and less maybe. But the problem of adaptability, what I say is that our rules and regulation, are they fast enough to change? Our schools curriculums, are they fast enough to change and adapt to what is going on in the world? Like yourself, I come from military background, where we do drills. We do a lot of scenarios, different scenarios. I now also do it because I'm in the shipping business now. We do a lot of drills. What if two ships collide? What if there is a fire on board? What if the ship goes aground? And we do exercise this one. And then there are a lot of lessons learned, and we try to change our system to better. It was very interesting that you said in 2019, the UK has done a mega exercise of pandemic happening, although probably they didn't take all the lessons learned, but it was something good that they have done it. I don't know how much of that we do here. You know, a few years ago, I saw a model was made. If there is a tsunami in Oman Sea, there is a tectonic area there. There is a possibility of earthquake. If there is a tsunami, there will be a huge tsunami coming towards Shat al-Khorum and Khorum within 7 minutes. So I wonder, do we have an exercise, a drill done how to evacuate people if such thing happens? I don't think we have. There are no plans like this. So the readiness for such things is very important. Before I ask my question, the leadership, you say the human touch of it. Now I am in a business where we run ships. Ships are very remote, as you can imagine, but we have to put across our values, leadership style, ways of doing things to people very remotely. You said the colonel there to shout over the radio. I think this is what we have been doing through emails, maybe shouting or so on. So this leads me to my question. In a pandemic or in situations like this, where is the terminology situational leadership? Thank you.
Very, very interesting. I'll just defend myself with the shouting. It was just an example of how you might do it. It's not necessarily the right way of doing it. There are plenty of people for whom shouting doesn't work at all. And there's the gentle touch, as you know clearly from your background, that some people need a pat on the back, some people need to be shouted at. But that's the emotional connection which makes you a leader that doesn't just shout or just be too weak. Uncertainty is because of the fragility. We know what's going on. We just don't know how bad it's going to be, though, and that's the uncertainty. When something happens, there's a financial crash. It's uncertain because we don't seem to be able to predict it very well, and we don't seem to be able to get out of it very quickly. So that we know it's going to happen. Financial crises happen every decade, pretty much. We know there's another one coming in 10 years' time. But the uncertainty is not knowing quite when it'll come and how bad it might be. And this is what we have to protect ourselves against. Our rules and regulations, I agree entirely, are far too rigid. You know, our educational establishments and the military, we're taught drills, but we're also taught to think way out of the box, or if necessary, just smash the box completely and do something different. If you can fool the instructors, you might fool the enemy. And that's what we have to do with life. We have to say, no, we're not thinking that way just because we've thought about it for the last 200 years. And you made the very good point about our education system. The education system in the United Kingdom is appalling. It hasn't changed for 150 years. It's the same rigid subjects and the same rigid way of people sitting in a classroom being taught stuff and then regurgitating it. It's ridiculous. There was a wonderful study in the United States where they said, right, we need these children to learn this stuff. So we're going to teach it to them in a way that suits them. So they said, you need to do this task. And there were no rules. So some of them ran outside and played for the hour they were allocated. They came back and did the task in 2 minutes. Others sat there rigidly for an hour, wrote everything down and did the task. Some played for a while, came back and sat down and got on with it and did it. They all achieved it, but in completely different ways. And this is what we should allow. And this is the emotional intelligence of understanding how different people react. Because ultimately you want them to do the same thing to help you and the country and the region and everything else. So let's totally agree with that. Let's see not what we're doing wrong, whether we not getting it right from the start. Maybe we're shooting ourselves in the foot before we've even started. So let's have a look at the regulatory process and see if that's the thing that's holding us back. Totally agree. Drills do work. And you spoke about a tsunami happening. That's a difficult one because it's quite a long way to the hills from Kurram. And okay, if you're on Kurram Heights, you'll be fine probably, but there's going to be an awful lot of people running up the road and that's not going to help. A lot of people are going to die. So you do need to have contingencies, but similarly, you need to be careful not to frighten people, because they're suddenly going to say, oh my goodness, I'm not staying in Muscat. I'm going up to Jebel Aftar, where it's not likely to be hit by a flash flood in a wadi or a tsunami or anything else. So you have to balance what you tell people for their own good with the risk of frightening people. And I think that was one of the things that held back the British government, perhaps, was they didn't want to frighten people with too much science. But instead of saying it's dangerous, they got it. I think they got it wrong. So, I mean, the Royal Oman Police Civil Defence, I mean, they do have some fantastic ideas. They do rehearsals, and I think the reaction to Cyclone Gono in 2008, I think, they made mistakes, but they got a lot of it right, really right. And I know they put in place a lot of planning afterwards to make sure that the small bits they got wrong would not happen again. But the problem is that the greater distance from the previous crisis, sadly, there is less emphasis on maintaining the readiness. I mean, that is certain. And we do tend to fight the last war the way we stopped the previous one. So your point about looking ahead at what might happen has got to be a constant brainstorm of people. Because if we say, well, we're prepared for this, if that doesn't happen, something else does, we think, oh, didn't see that one coming. You've got to be prepared and flexible enough for everything. So to sort of summarize your questions, uncertainty is just the fragility, I think, more than we are certain that it's going to go badly wrong again, but we're not quite sure how. So it's the fragility which creates the uncertainty. Revolutions do take a while. We need to look at rules and regulations. I think our education system really needs to be revised and completely. What are you trying to achieve? Trying to educate someone? Well, there are lots of different ways of doing it in a way that's really appealing. We've got to have drills and we've got to think about what might happen next. I totally agree with you. And we don't have to shout at everybody necessarily.
on situational leadership?
Sorry, on situational leadership, that is very hard to teach. You can only lead by example. I think that is the only way to do it. You cannot say, you've got to react to everything. You've got to say, see what he did, that was good. See what he did, that wasn't good. Situational awareness is absolutely everything. I mean, and it comes down to your other point about being ready for everything. The good leader, when something happens, he does something straight away. If there a situation happens and the leader is seen to be doing nothing, everything collapses, you know. The leadership is never more important than in a situation that you weren't expecting. And that is the sign of the good leader, who is able to react strongly, quickly, in a way that saves lives and achieves the aim. But very hard to teach. All you can do is give them the general tools, but they've got to learn from other people. And that's where the culture comes in. Totally. And again, that's the strength of Oman. Culture is so strong. It can be applied, adapted to everything.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matt. Mr. Simon, before we move to your question, there's just one question in the chat which was raised earlier by Mr. Bill Hunt, if I may just go through that. He's saying this is a very interesting presentation. My thanks to you, Mr. Minshall. We saw the prediction of many countries turning around in a dramatic way in 2021. When can we predict a turn around in Oman? So that was a question from Mr. Bill. And Mr. Simon, if you would like to raise your question so that Mr. Matt can answer them both.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Reham, thank you very much indeed. And surprisingly, I don't have any question. However, I would like to comment rather on certain things. And I think the questions that you raised tonight, Matt, such as how we harness values from crisis, the opportunity, for beneficial change, building resilience, and whether we go back to old normal or learn and adapt. These questions should be posed, should be asked at various levels. The individual should ask these questions. The corporation should ask these questions. The country should ask these questions. And the world should ask these questions. And the answers may not be the same. Let me touch on two things. First, the health. You said we are not ready. Nobody was ready. In the present situation, the way nations work separately with a little bit of cooperation, how can we be ready? Who is the leader that will is courageous enough, you talked about courage, to invest $1 billion to prepare for a COVID-20? And what about if it doesn't come? Who will take that responsibility? So for such an issue, definitely, like Dr. Nada said, it is not only going towards more cooperation. I think that responsibility should be given to a United Nations authority, the WHO, for example, who were sleeping, and I think they are still sleeping. Maybe they are not empowered. Maybe we have to review their structure, but definitely the health, especially if it is pandemic, has to be handled. It is these guys with common funds that should do the research and advice and issue vaccine. I think so. If we take another example on, we have to adapt and learn. I mean, individuals like myself, and it was easy to adapt. I bought a laptop, but take a corporate or a government, take a airline company. How would they adapt? The price to adapt is so huge. Take owners of hotels and chains of hotels. How can they adapt? It is so huge. They will have to one day by force. So on certain issues, We have to go back to old normal. On other issues, we have to go to normal with adjustment. On other issues, we have to maintain the restriction, but definitely learn and adapt in general. So what I want to say, your talk gave so much areas of thought, and by extending it to the various level of the stakeholders, we find that answers may be a little bit different. But at any rate, it was an extremely interesting discussion. It asks every one of us to ask certain questions that we have to live with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just before I come on to Bill's question, Simon, as usual, very interesting. I want to throw something in quite unusual, perhaps. I agree entirely. Somebody has to take responsibility. But also corporates have to take responsibility, not just the country leadership. And you mentioned two things, which I think you could, in hindsight, of course, but okay, airlines, it was all about passengers. This is how they got their economic throughput. We need to be able to have certain influence on corporates that are completely divorced from government. Now, for me, I'd have said to the airlines, right, you're not getting any passengers, but we're going to use you and you're going to help us to transport medicines, beds, ventilators all over the world under the WHO's direction. They're going to commandeer you. You'll get paid.
Yeah.
And hotels, you're not getting any guests, so you're going to become a hospital. Off you go. And, you know, there is a contingency to do that. And I'm sort of making this up as I go along, but I think that is a way that we could encompass everybody very quickly.
Yeah.
And the responsibility, well, we spend a lot of money on defense and security, most of which is never used. You know, every country has warehouses full of tanks and ships that are able to destroy entire countries, but we don't use them. Why don't we put some of that money into making sure that the government, if there's an epidemic, can suddenly work from home overnight? Let's have that contingency. Let's have, you know, warehouses full of laptops. Let's change the transport system so it's not transporting commuters to offices. Let's enable the offices to be used for accommodation overnight. Change it, be adaptable. That's what I would say. And I totally agree. Someone's got to take charge. It's about leadership. Somebody, and I think the WHO might have done it if they'd had facility to have a leader who was given the responsibility and had the executive authority to say, right, United States is doing this, Britain's doing that, Europe, you deal with this, Africa, you deal with that. That would have worked, but it was too reactive.
Yeah, but that's the intention of creating United Nations, you know, whether on political issues, whether on FAO for the food, whether on WHO for the health, whether UNESCO for, you know, other, and this is where Dr. Nada put us in that direction, whereby I think one of the conclusions that we all work to is to give more structure and more power and more leadership to these organizations. Not necessarily in all our aspects of our life. No, in our folk dancing, we want it to be local, for example, in our values, in, you know, but in certain matters that concern humanity, we have to empower and structure these organizations to take the responsibility, as you are saying. Thank you.
I agree entirely. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. If you can take the last two questions and then we close with Mr. Mike, Mr. Haji Adam and Mr. Khamis Aglushi. Mr. Haji Adam.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Bill Hunt did ask a question about the turnaround time. If I knew that, I'd be a very rich man. I think it's very, very hard to gauge that one. All I can say is that I feel that Oman will be quite quick because of what I find the extraordinary leadership of His Majesty Sultan Haytham. He said, we need to do this, we need to do that. He's merged ministries. He's brought in ITHRA into the Ministry of Commerce and Trade, and he's taken a lot of austerity, and he is looking at short, medium, long-term So very interesting question, very difficult to answer. I think it'll be quick for Oman. That is my view, and I'm going to do everything I can to help.
Thanks for your input, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sorry, I interrupted again.
That's fine. Mr. Haji?
Thank you very much, Matt. It's nice to see you after quite a long time. I think we saw you 2020.
Indeed, I think it was May. Indeed, yes. Very nice to see you again.
So, I have nothing actually, and I agree with what you said and Khalil. From what I gather, and here listening to you and everybody else, and from what we feel around, we have a big problem with the phrase communication without S in this country. If we can fix that one, I think a lot of things can be fixed. We have a lot of good thoughts, good ideas flying around, but I don't know if they are landing on the right desk or put in the right context. So with this, I'll leave the floor for Mr. Khamis Ali Malala to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interesting point. I will think about that in great depth.
Thank you, Haji. Thank you, Matt. I have a very simple question for you, because you've been bombarded with a lot of questions. Can we label COVID as a world war because it have changed all our life and our businesses and all other things? And your plan with its 10, 80, 10, 80% will change the whole businesses in hotels, airlines, and all other. And thank you very much.
Another excellent question. It's and so very hard to answer, but I will do my best to give it. Very, very difficult. Just to go back to Haji's idea, the good ideas are there. We just need to harness them, and we can do that. I know it, and it's just, and you're the guys to do it. If you see the ideas, you're the one that needs to grab them, make them work, enable youth. That is the answer there. No excuse otherwise.
I think Khalil is listening.
But thank you very much for the question. Yes, it is a war. There's no question. It has changed us absolutely. In my view, there has to be, and the change it's got to be welcomed. We cannot accept that we're going back to normal. 80%, no, it won't work with everybody. That was simply to try to illustrate how much we could change. But no, hotels cannot. Hotels are all about 80% full. That is certain. It's completely reverse. An airline is only getting paid if it's 80% full. So that one, it's completely the reverse. But maybe that was too uncertain. I know that airlines, they're panicking every month. Sorry, before the crisis, desperate, and prices are dropping to try and get more people in. And it seemed to me, I mean, with all the crisis you had with airlines over the last 2 decades and all the mergers because they could not cope with the situation, KLM, France, most major European airlines went through a massive crisis, and not necessarily related to financial crisis. They just weren't ready for uncertainty. So if they weren't ready before the crisis, they certainly weren't going to be ready during the crisis. Therefore, my advice to them, both hotels and airlines, would be, I think you need to find a better way of working. And maybe it's not all about passengers, maybe it's about freight, maybe it's about becoming part of the aid system so that, the collective money of the WHO or the United Nations actually finances 10% of airlines, but is allowed then to say, right, we have a crisis in Rwanda. I need 12 Oman airplanes, I need 5 from Emirates, I need 6 from BA, and they need to land at Kinshasa in 5 hours. Deal with it. That's a bit of leadership that might be something we could adopt. Pretty drastic, and the airlines will be saying, nope, but perhaps they don't have that option anymore.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Madam Maggie, do you have any question before we end our session with Mr. Mike?
No questions from me, but a very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mike, over to you, please.
Thank you, Reham. So, Matt, you've certainly given us a template and a presentation that's raised a huge range of questions on emotional intelligence, collaboration, sense of humanity, scientists and economists, the new front line, younger generational leadership, drawing leadership from communities, prolonged complexity, adaptability, scenario planning, questions from all levels. When can we expect the turnaround? Communications and qualities of leaders. You've really given us something to think about. Essentially, you took us carefully and in a structured way through, there's no option about thinking that we can return to the old normal. It's now either normal with adjustments, normal but with restrictions, or we learn and we adapt. The key being communication and having a platform such as is provided these days through the internet. You've talked about there really are opportunities for beneficial change, but health and hygiene have to be addressed. Work practices need refining. Probably leadership structures need to be looked at. We have to understand fragility, financial system, the health system, and we have to build in resilience too, where we identify fragility. You talked about a new one, solar flares. That may be the next issue around the corner. But you've said most likely the trends the economists are suggesting indicate at some time a post-pandemic boom and an opening for business. So on that optimistic note, may I thank you again for being with all of us. May I thank Mr. Khalil. A big thank you to Reham for keeping us all together. A great big thank you to Majlis Al Khonji and to all of you and your families over this holiday. Eid Mubarak, be safe. Inshallah, we will see you all again soon. Shukran jazilan and masalama. Thank you, Mr. Khalil.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you and Eid Mubarak. Thank you, Matt. Thank you again. We'll see you soon.
Ali Barik.
We miss London very much. So
I
I don't believe in this 80% thing. I think things will change within by 2025 probably. We will get semi-normal and then we'll forget about all of this. And otherwise, business will not run. You see, airlines, hotels, hospitality, restaurants. So let's hope for the best. Thank you very much.
Inshallah.